Thank you for joining us on the session on the RAMSeS IPF. So with that, thank you for joining, and I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to our presenters.
Hello, good morning, everybody. This is Jen Teixeira, and I'm the Senior Director of Research Administration at OSP. And then I'll let Jack introduce himself as well.
Hi, I'm Jack Hartley. I am a grants analyst in SPO.
So we'll be presenting on some essentials of RAMSeS IPF today. And like Samantha said, please feel free to add questions as we go along. And if we can't get to them, we'll be sure to follow up. But there'll also be resources at the end of the presentation. So next slide. So today we're going to go over some kind of an overview of each proposal intake screen for you, as well as we're going to pepper those with general tips and tricks from OSP and SPO's perspective as far as what we review and kind of to help you out as you're submitting your IPFs. We're going to go over the document and attachments review as well, since those go into your IPF and a lot of detail review takes place there, as well as provide some final notes and thoughts on kind of the IPF submission process, and hopefully have some time for some questions. So what is RAMSeS IPF? You might have heard it called very different things. So it is the internal processing form, but it can be referred to as both the IPF or the eIPF, or your proposal or your internal proposal. All of those things kind of encompass the IPF. It's required whenever a principal investigator anticipates receiving or plans to compete for new funding. And it collects both financial and compliance information, as well as all the documentation that's needed for us to complete an internal review of that proposal submission before it goes out to our sponsor. Next slide. So we'll just jump right into the screens. This is your general info screen. And I wanted to point out a few things with the general info screen. The funding agency is whoever our sponsor is, regardless of where the original funding comes from. So, for example, if another university is going to be funding us off of a proposal they're submitting to the NIH, it would be that other institution who would be our funding agency. The prime funding agency, on the other hand, is going to be NIH, because the prime source of that funding is coming from NIH. These two things are really important to get right for various reasons. Obviously, we need to know where that prime source of funding is coming from when we get to that award stage, because, for example, federal requirements might be applicable, but also even throughout the proposal submission, because they might have different deadlines. So I'll talk about that on the next screen. The short project name is another thing I wanted to point out. That really is kind of for your internal reference and for your use. So it can be anything that you call it. It does not need to be, of course, the full project name. And then the project start and end date. It's really important that when you're filling out that project start and end date, that it's allowable within the proposal guidelines that you're reviewing, because sometimes they will explain exactly what the start and end date will be. So we check for that in our office just to make sure that that's within the proposal guidelines. And if you can check for that prior to it coming to us, that's one less thing. So next slide. Okay. To keep going with the general information screen, we've got the proposal type. It's really important that you identify the proposal type appropriately because that can impact our award setup. So if it's a new proposal type, it's going to be a different kind of setup than if we're talking about a competitive renewal or something like that. So that's very important. Award type includes options such as contract, grant, incoming subaward, clinical trials, cooperative agreements, all of those various different award types. Generally speaking, you're going to be able to find this information when you go through the proposal announcement. It'll tell you what that funding mechanism will be, but it's not always going to be 100%. And what I mean by that is it's possible we will think that it's going to come in as a grant, but it ends up coming in as a contract. So that can be changed on the back end, but if we can get it right on the front end, it always helps. In the cases where, for example, I explained to you, where we're not the prime, we're a subrecipient, we would want to identify that as an incoming subcontract. Another thing is that submission method. That's really important because we need to know, how those materials should be submitted to the sponsor. Is this going to be emailed to them? Is this going to go into a new portal? If so, for example, we want to look at that and make sure we have access to the portal, or if we don't, who's submitting to that portal? Because our instances were foundation portals, PIs can submit directly. We still have to do that preliminary review and approval process, but we need to know who's going to be submitting and by what mechanism. And then proposal deadline is really important here. So the sponsor deadline is our sponsor. So going back to that general info screen previously, we talked about the difference between our funding agency and our prime funding agency. And it's really important that this sponsor deadline reflects our funding agency, not the prime funding agency. And I'll give you an example of where that can kind of trip us up. So if the prime funding agency is NIH and we're submitting our proposal to Duke, Duke will require us to give them 15 days before the prime funding deadline to get our application. That's our deadline. It's not going to be our prime funding source. And that's really important because that drives our review process to ensure that we meet that deadline and we get it to our sponsor in a timely manner. So I just wanted to point that out. Next slide, please.
So in this slide, this screen, we're talking about the personnel page. And this is where you are going to put in the personnel who are active in the first year of the award. So if it is a 5-year award that you are submitting an application for, you're going to put the personnel who are active just for year 1 on this page. If it's an RPPR and it's just the 1 year, or it's a 1-year award, then you're going to put the personnel for just that 1 year. Now, the university's eligibility policy states that full-time permanent EHRA faculty may serve as PIs. Under special circumstances, individuals that do not meet this criteria may serve as lead PIs with written approval from the dean, director, or department head. So, for example, if you have a PI who's got like a 0.5 FTE or a 9-month appointment, in that case, a request to waive the university's PI eligibility operating standard must be submitted and approved by the reviewing office and should be attached to the IPF as well. Lead PIs are also required to have a minimum of 1% effort, either directly charged or contributed as cost share on most sponsored projects to reflect their leadership. There are exceptions to this policy. One example would be a supplement to an existing project under which the PI's effort is already included for the same scope of work that is ongoing and does not require additional effort. Now, the personnel listed in this page of the IPF are directly associated with the project for COI purposes. So all personnel that are working directly on the project during this first budget period need to be listed, as I said at the beginning, and not just in the internal budget attachment. It is very important that the personnel listed here match what's in the internal budget and match what's in the submitted budget and budget justification. We're going to harp on how all these things have to match with it, with the IPF, with the attachments and the application. That's one of the most important things that you should take away, is that everything should match and tie together. One common confusing point for personnel, this is pretty kind of mechanism specific, but is when to use the role of fellow. There are two fellow options. There is fellow and NIH fellow. You use an NIH fellow when applying for an NIH fellowship. This has the specific action of making that fellow certify the IPF in the same way that a PI has to certify the IPF. The other fellow role doesn't do that, but that is required for NIH. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. Next slide, please. Also on this tab is where you would add non-UNC personnel. This is going to be like your independent contractors and consultants. They must be listed using their personal email address. They can't use their institutional email because it implies involvement of their institution as the entity, which is not a consultant or independent contractor function. The COI training is tied to this email address used by the independent contractor. And so they should use that same email address each time they are added to a proposal to ensure that their training is associated with their account. It can be corrected post-award, but it just slows things down. Once again, the more correctly we do this on the front end, the more smoothly and quickly things can move on the back end. There are several questions that you see listed here. The PI should be able to provide you with the responses to those questions. And that's pretty much all that we need to know about that page. You can go on to the next tab, Samantha. Thank you. And here we are on the budget page. Once again, the information put here in the budget page needs to match what is in the attached internal budget and needs to match what is in the submitted sponsor budget. Now, UNC policy requires us to charge the maximum allowable federal negotiated F&A rate based on the location and type of sponsored activity. We do have exceptions that are granted to nonprofit sponsors and governmental agencies that have explicit published policies limiting F&A recovery. This means that they need to be published either somewhere officially on their website or within their proposal announcement guidelines. An email saying we only allow 20% F&A does not suffice. In the case where an F&A exception is requested for a sponsor that doesn't meet the previously mentioned criteria, then you need to submit an F&A waiver request, which is conveniently located in the templates on the OSP website. And this request needs to be reviewed and approved by the executive director of OSP. Standard process is to calculate the modified total direct costs, which excludes equipment, tuition, and subcontract costs over $25,000. But not all awards use that base type. Always, always, always review your sponsored guidelines for what is allowable, what their requirements and restrictions are. Within the IPF, we are trying to make sure that we are both following sponsor guidelines and UNC's internal policies and procedures. And if there is cost share, you need to indicate that. There are two types of cost share. I won't go into it too deeply. You've got your agency mandated and voluntary. Agency mandated might be a situation where a sponsor says that the university needs to commit $20,000 to this research project. That would be agency mandated. You would need to put that in there. You would need to denote who is covering that cost in order to get it approved. Voluntary cost share is generally discouraged, but is like a situation where maybe a PI says, I'm going to use $5,000 of my startup funds to cover X materials for Y proposal. That also needs to be listed and approved here in the IPF. Next slide, please.
Okay.
Jen,
So, Yeah, so we'll go into subcontracts. So just to kind of give you an idea of what we're reviewing for when we look at this, we're reviewing the subaward documents that you've provided, and we're confirming consistency with the IPF. As Jack mentioned, we're going to kind of harp on this throughout the presentation because consistency between those documentation is really important. We're going to confirm that, we want you to confirm that the subrecipient has a compliant COI policy. Just to be clear, this is only if we're talking about PHS NSF submissions. That includes where the prime sponsor is PHS NSF, as well as our sponsor. So in both of those scenarios, we want to make sure that they have a compliant COI policy. We're going to be looking to make sure that all of the required attachments have been included. So we've got a letter of intent with signatures, and it has an AOR signature on there. It's got a scope of work, it's got a detailed budget, and it's got a budget justification. And those budget numbers match with what's in our budget, matches what's in the application package, and matches what the total amounts are that we have. If, for example, you've indicated, yes, there's human subjects, or no, there's no animal subjects, but we're looking at the scope of work, or we're looking at the budget, and you seem to have animal fees in that budget, but you've indicated no, that's going to be a red flag for us. So we're going to go ahead and kind of come back and ask questions. So those are some of the things we're looking for when we're reviewing this screen, and some of the things you kind of need to be mindful of when you're filling it out. And there should be obviously a subcontractor listed for each and every one of those subcontracts that you have on that project. Next slide. So again, I'm just going to kind of stress that when you're talking about subcontractor personnel and your prime sponsor or your funding agency sponsor is PHS or NSF, we kind of have to put a stop here. If you have done that search from the previous page, looked up that website for the FCOI clearinghouse and determined that they don't currently have a compliant COI policy, because what that means is we need to enter the personnel from our subcontractor onto the subcontractor personnel tab. And the reason that's so important is because when we get to that award phase, we need to have them basically do a COI disclosure and make sure they've got the appropriate trainings so that they can fall under our COI policy. And if we do that right at the proposal stage, it really helps when we get to that award setup stage, which again is, I think, another kind of theme that we want to really emphasize with the IPF. The better information we get in at this proposal phase, the better off we are at award setup. So thank you. Next slide. Okay, well, research subjects is, I think, pretty explanatory. If you've got human subjects who are going to be participating in the project, we want to make sure that that's captured here. Again, we're checking to make sure that that's consistent with the documentation we have throughout the rest of the application, the scope of work, the budget justification. If there is a human subjects research being done at some of our subsites, we need to also indicate yes. Often the IRB protocol is not, we're not going to require that it be approved at this stage. It might not even be submitted until later on. But in the case of NIH, for example, at that just-in-time phase, usually we need to get that done. But you can indicate either that it's just in time or not yet submitted. So those are definitely options. Next slide. Okay, and continuing on, we've also got the similar kind of thing for animal subjects. We're making sure that it's consistent with whatever other documentation you've submitted to us. And one thing I'll mention for both research subjects and animal subjects, we're also looking at the proposal announcement, making sure that for some reason they're not requiring that we have an approved protocol. Like I said, that's not common, but there's always nuances to each sponsor, so just be mindful of that. And again, this is done usually at the just-in-time phase, or prior to award setup.
Now, intellectual property, most of the information for intellectual property is going to be included in the application package. A lot of these things that we're talking about right now, you're definitely going to be getting this information and double checking with your PI to determine how you need to answer these questions. They are pretty self-explanatory otherwise. It is important to get this right, because if selected yes, then the Office of Technology and Commercialization needs to be involved and aware of it. A lot of these questions that you answer in the IPF generate notifications to the required offices if a notice of award comes across, so that the right people can be involved to make sure that everything gets set up properly and that all protocol and procedures are accurately followed. If this application package indicates anticipated IP, but this IP tab is left blank, then we are going to come back and ask for additional information so that we can make sure that it's set up properly. And if the proposal is an SBIR or an STTR, then you need to make sure that you select the correct phase. And you may or may not know this, but we automatically waive F&A for phase 1 SBIR STTRs. That ties back into the budget page, but just important reminder there. Next tab, please. And there are all these other additional IPF tabs for review. There's so much information that we're collecting here, and it is used by so many people. And sometimes you might be going through and saying, why am I answering this? But literally just yesterday, Jen and I were talking, and she was running a report from the locations tab to help answer some questions that were requested of her. So this information is important, and this information needs to be consistent throughout the application. So if you have a subcontract to the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, then you need to make sure that you mark Michigan in your location of budget expenditures. If you have work with a foreign subcontract, you need to make sure that you list that as a location of budget expenditures, or a location that's relevant to your project. You can definitely get this information by reviewing your budget and scope of work. And if you're unsure of what the answer should be, work with your PI to make sure that you're answering this information correctly. Next tab, please. Oh, I think we actually skipped one. There should be research material before this. There we go. Thank you. Same thing here. Research material, your PI and their research team are going to be the ones who are best able to provide you with this information. And once again, this is really important, because if it's awarded, it is going to notify the proper departments within UNC to make sure that everything is set up so that people are kept safe, so that we are not running afoul of any rules and regulations that might have to do with, say, handling avian flu virus. We certainly want to make sure that we have all that information captured and the right people are notified. The more correct this information is on the front end, the more effectively we can set up an award on the back end. Next page, please. And export control. This page used to be much more robust with a lot more questions. You are welcome, everybody. We have simplified it. Work with your PI to make sure that you're answering this correctly. If there is a need for export control, then the export control office is going to be notified. And we'll work with you to make sure that everything is in line as it needs to be upon notice of award. Next page.
Okay, now we're at document review. So you filled out all of those details in the forms themselves, which does, I'll just kind of share again with what Jack said. It's really important that the information you enter in those fields is correct to the best of your knowledge. So coordinating that effort with your principal investigator, co-PIs, and project team is really, really great, because the more correct information we get on that front end, the better off the award setup is. But then next is all of the documents that we need to review. So next. Okay, so we've got many different kinds of attachments that can be required. And just, I would note that it depends on the funding announcement, the proposal guidelines, what those are, because there could be nuances to each proposal submission requirement where there's a document that's not even on this list that may be required of that announcement. So just be mindful of that. But in general, most of the required documents is we always want to see a copy of that funding announcement, proposal guidelines, because we really kind of use that as our checklist for what's required in that proposal submission. So it's the first thing we're going to look at. And it should be the first thing that you're looking at when you're trying to kind of build that proposal and make sure that we've got everything we need. The internal budget, budget justification, scope of work, letter of intent, for example, if we've got a subrecipient, all the additional subrecipient documents, budget justification, scope of work, and of course, letter intent. We always want to have a final submitted proposal in that application because we need to know what we actually submitted to the sponsor. Because I think all of you probably are aware, we go back and forth with draft documentation. One of the things we do on the admin side in the central office is we make sure to mark that one as final so that when we get back to it as the award stage, we'll know which one was actually the final submitted proposal. If, for example, there's a draft agreement, we're going to go ahead and we will want a copy of that attached to it. Let's say that the funding announcement actually has terms and conditions. That definitely needs to be part of it. F&A waiver requests, cost share commitment letters. These are all things that we'll want in the attachment sections. So next slide. Proposal guidelines. So how we review the proposal guidelines, like I said, this is kind of where we start everything. This is our checklist, and this should be your checklist. We're looking to see what the due date is. If, for example, we have the proposal guidelines from NIH, but our sponsor is Duke, we're taking that with a grain of salt because we need to know what our actual deadline is. But we need to know what the prime one is as well. What are the formatting requirements? Do they require certain font? Do they require, how certain page limits on different things? That's all really relevant information. Are there restrictions? So is there a budgetary restriction that we need to know about when we're reviewing the budget? Like, for example, do they not allow for PI salary, but we've got PI salary in the budget you just submitted to us? We're going to be looking to make sure that we've met those restrictions. PI eligibility. So for example, we have our own internal PI eligibility requirement. We also have our own waiver requirements, but that doesn't circumvent the sponsor's PI eligibility requirements. So we might have instances where our PI has very rigid PI eligibility requirements that are more restrictive than our internal PI eligibility. And so we're looking at that to make sure that that individual who submitted as the PI meets those more restrictive requirements, not necessarily our internal requirements. Does the program announcement limit facilities and administrative costs. So if it's in there and it's published and we're not talking about an industry sponsor, then we can go ahead and move it forward. But we also want to verify that whatever that F&A restriction is, it's consistent with how we've budgeted. So did we include all of our F&A despite the fact that there was a restriction in there? And of course, we would want to remove that. Also, special terms and conditions. So, for example, if we see anything in there about organizational conflict of interest, that really needs to be highlighted and submitted to us as soon as possible. The COI office needs a minimum of 5 business days to be able to process those. And in those cases where we're not getting them within those 5 business days and triggering that to the COI office, the only recourse we have is to add an exception letter. While it is something we can include in that submission to indicate that that OCI will be done at the award stage, not all sponsors will accept that. So if we can, be able to get that sooner rather than later, that's really important. And something I'll kind of highlight later as well is if you see that in the announcement and you submit it to us early, put it in the notes, highlight it and say, hey, this has an OCI requirement. It's just, it'll be at the top of our list. We'll see what that is. And communicate with us. Also, are there terms and conditions that maybe we can't accept, or terms and conditions that basically by submitting that proposal, we've indicated that we are accepting that we have problems with. In those cases, we might want to put in an exception letter to say that we would want to negotiate some of those terms and conditions. So those are some of the things. I will just also add that be cautious, because you might have a 2-page proposal guideline, but it's got like 10 links in it. And those links lead to other requirements and other restrictions, or maybe it leads to terms and conditions that are incorporated as part of that proposal guidelines. So always click the links and the links from the links, because you got to follow those breadcrumbs to make sure what we're agreeing to or what the requirements of that submission are when you're submitting it. So next slide. So budget and budget justification. Again, you're reviewing the funding announcement and you're reviewing for any salary caps or any restrictions when we're reviewing that budget, making sure that we're being consistent with what our sponsor is requiring of us. We're confirming that the UNC Chapel Hill personnel's institutional salary and benefits are correct. So we're checking that and making sure that we have the most up-to-date salaries, the most up-to-date fringe benefit rates in there. So that way we are submitting the best proposal, moving that forward. We're confirming that we have the correct F&A rate and the base is being calculated correctly. So if it's modified total direct cost, or in some cases when sponsors have kind of a variation of that, and total direct cost or some kind of variation with a restricted F&A rate, we're making sure that that's calculated appropriately. Confirming that the amounts requested in your budget match your justification. So we're taking that budget and we're comparing it to the budget justification, not only that the numbers match, but throughout that justification. So for example, let's say that you have materials and supplies in your detailed budget that you're submitting to your sponsor, but you have nothing about that in your justification, and that's required of the sponsor. We'd want to make sure that we add something about that. Or if you have travel in your justification, but it's not listed in your budget. So we're just, making sure that before we get those submissions out to the sponsor, there's consistency in our documentation. Next slide.
Oh, sorry, that one's me. Yes, scope of work. Once again, with these attachments, everything has to be in agreement. If your scope of work details working with mice, but your budget doesn't have anything about cost for mice, your justification doesn't have anything about animals, you don't have iCook marked on your IPF, then we're going to ask questions. We want to make sure that everything is in agreement, that nothing is contradicting anything else within the IPF, within the attachments, or within the application. That's really, I don't know if we could stress that enough. That's really the main goal of the IPF in this whole process. Next page, please. Same with subcontract documents. They need to be consistent. Their letter of intent, the amount in that needs to match their R&R budget. What their budget and budget justification say needs to also be in agreement with what their scope of work says. And we need to have their institutional signature in the letter of intent. I saw in the Q&A somebody asked what an AOR is. An AOR would be somebody like me, a person who reviews a proposal package, makes sure that everything is correct, and signs off to say, we ensure that the information here is accurate and that we are confident to submit this grant. So just getting an LOI signed by like a PI at an institution is not enough. It needs to be signed by an authorized organizational representative. Next page, please. And then our internal proposal deadlines. We have a process, and on our end, when we're getting an IPF with all these attachments, we need to have adequate time to review all this information to make sure that it is accurate and consistent. Within 5 business days, you need to have that IPF routed. It needs to have your draft budget, and it needs to have your scope of work and your budget justification and any other required documents based on the mechanism that's being applied for to be reviewed. Within 2 business days, you should have those final components ready for review in Cayuse or Proposal Central, or I guess I was going to say Fastlane, but I think Fastlane's gone now. Whatever portal you're applying through, they should be uploaded and ready for us to review. These deadlines are important for ensuring the success of an application. I just thought of a kind of extended sports metaphor, so I apologize. Hopefully this doesn't go over anybody's head, but it's about American football, and we all know what that is. You as a research administrator are sort of like the quarterback, and the football is sort of like the application. The SPS or grants analyst who's clicking submit after review is sort of like the wide receiver who's trying to score a touchdown. And the IPF is like the huddle. If we rush the huddle, then everybody who's involved doesn't know exactly what's happening, and that play is less likely to be successful. That wide receiver is less likely to catch the ball and carry it over the goal line, i.e. successfully submit the grant. So that's why we want to follow these deadlines. The consequences of things being routed late are on the next slide. And they are things like possibly missing compliance with proposal guidelines, non-compliance with university policies, needing to negotiate extensive revisions if a notice of award comes across because we didn't catch something because we didn't have the time to, and in the worst case scenario, having to refuse an award because proper compliance measures weren't met. This is why it's so important that you work with your PI, you work with your research team and your department to make sure that all of this information is routed in a timely manner so that your SPS and your grants analyst are able to best help you out to tighten up the application and to make sure that everything is as shipshape as can be for submission.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Okay, so some final notes, thoughts. Early communication is really, really helpful. Work with your OSP representative, your SPO representative, the person who's been assigned to that proposal, and communicate with them. It's helpful to know things are coming, to know if there's any pitfalls. You know, just kind of going back to those deadlines that we talked about, that internal deadline, I think that was a great analogy. We've got, we've got certain things we need in 5 business days. We've got other things we need in 2 business days. But, the other thing is we also are only available during business hours. And so it's really important to note that if a proposal is due at 11:59, that SPS or grant analyst probably isn't going to be online at 11 o'clock. And so the early communication, that back and forth, is extremely helpful. So we make sure we have a plan to get that proposal in prior to when the business hours are over, to ensure we are able to make that successful. A copy of the submitted proposal should always be uploaded into the IPF, even if for some reason we've given approval and let's say it's a situation where the PI has access to the portal and submits it, we still need a copy of what actually went in. It's important at that award stage. So that's another thing I just want to highlight. Take advantage of reviewing past IPFs. That's absolutely fine with us. And it helps if you understand kind of that IPF process. However, I really caution you here because you have to be aware that guidelines and processes are always changing in research administration. I jokingly say that the one thing about research administration is it is always changing. And so you might have submitted a proposal to the exact same, proposal announcement the previous cycle, but since then, now there's a different budget requirement, or maybe the current and pending support document has different requirements. So just be really mindful of that when you're referencing back to old materials or old IPFs, that things change. Compliance requirements change. So something that we were allowed to or capable of doing that previous cycle maybe no longer is allowable. And so just be mindful of that. If you notice anything unusual at the time of the proposal stage, when it's sitting with you before you've submitted to us, really take advantage of the notes feature within in the IPF. Just highlight it. Let us know that, hey, this seems like out of the ordinary in the proposal announcement. Haven't seen that before. If you want to throw in on page 3 of the RFP, that's always helpful information, because then it's not only highlighting what you've already done the research on, but it's making sure that the team kind of focuses in on that first and foremost to kind of get back to you. That kind of ties in hand with that early communication too. So I think both kind of are both key elements of the success of an IPF. So here are your resources. For general questions, I've provided some general email addresses for both the Office of Sponsored Programs and for the School of Medicine, as well as just to really stress that you can always work with your assigned sponsored program specialist or your assigned grants analyst if you have specific questions around your proposal submission. Reach out early, reach out often, and really communicate with those individuals.
Thank you for attending. Thank you to our presenters.